Imagine waking up tomorrow and scrolling like you always do, half awake, coffee still warm, thumb moving on instinct. Then you see it. A new video. A new face standing in front of the same familiar house. Same dirt road. Same trees. Same porch. And the words hit you immediately. I'm the Whittakers Caregiver now. Before you even have time to process that, there's another line. Urgent. Pressing. Emotional. They need donations immediately. That's not internet drama. That's danger. Because by 2026, the Whittaker story is no longer just about poverty, isolation, or a family living outside modern systems. It's about a vacuum. And vacuums don't stay empty for long. They get filled, sometimes by people who genuinely want to help, and sometimes by people who know exactly how to turn confusion into control. This is where we are now, not in the past, not in old clips, not in recycled outrage. We're in the aftermath phase, the phase where silence creates opportunity, and opportunity attracts the wrong kind of attention. So before we go any further, let's ground ourselves in reality. The Whittakers did not ask to become symbols. They did not ask to be case studies. They did not ask to be content. They lived the same way for decades, largely unseen, largely untouched, until the internet discovered them. And when that happened, the rules of their lives changed overnight, even though they never agreed to play by those rules. Attention doesn't just bring awareness. It brings traffic. It brings entitlement. It brings people who feel ownership over a story that was never theirs. And when the state stepped in, when adult protective services became involved, something critical shifted. The story went quiet. Details were sealed. Access was restricted. Public updates stopped. That silence wasn't accidental. It was procedural. It was legal. And it was meant to protect vulnerable people. But protection has a side effect. Silence creates a vacuum. And a vacuum is exactly where manipulation thrives. Here's what we know as of 2026. Some members of the Whittaker family were removed from the home in 2025. Others were not. Adult Protective Services is involved. Law enforcement has already investigated alleged financial exploitation connected to this family. That alone should tell you how serious the situation is. But here's what the public does not have. There is no official public spokesperson. There is no verified donation channel. There is no approved caregiver posting updates online. That absence is not an invitation. It is a boundary. And boundaries are the first thing scammers try to erase. Because if there is no official voice, anyone can try to become one. If there is no clear channel, anyone can invent one. If there is confusion, someone will step forward and say, I'll explain. That's how this starts. Not with force, not with paperwork, with confidence. I'm helping them. They asked me. They trust me. They don't understand technology, so I'm handling it. Those phrases sound harmless, compassionate even, but they're also the most common opening lines in exploitation cases involving vulnerable adults. And here's the part most people don't want to confront. A person does not need legal authority to cause harm. They only need access. Access to the property. Access to the people. Access to your empathy. That's it. They don't need to be appointed by a court to start collecting money. They don't need a title to create a donation link. They don't need credentials to tell a story that sounds believable enough to move people emotionally. Because exploitation doesn't start with documents. It starts with narrative control. And the Whittaker story has already proven how powerful that can be. Think about what has already happened. The family's hardship became viral. Money began flowing through unofficial channels. People positioned themselves as saviors. And law enforcement eventually stepped in. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because when vulnerable people are placed at the center of attention, the line between help and harm gets dangerously thin. Now, one more factor. Fear. Larry has reportedly said words that should stop anyone in their tracks. Don't talk to nobody. They're watching. That sentence alone tells you this is no longer a casual situation. It tells you oversight exists. It tells you scrutiny exists. And it tells you that the people still in that home are being told to retreat, not engage. When people are instructed to withdraw from the world, they become easier to isolate, easier to control, easier to speak for. And that's where the real risk lives. Because if Betty and Larry are quiet and the public is confused and the system is sealed, the only voices left are the ones who choose to insert themselves. So let's ask the question plainly. Can someone just show up and claim to be the Whittakers caregiver? Legally, no. Practically, someone might try. And the damage doesn't happen years later. It happens immediately. Money moves fast. Trust breaks fast. Isolation deepens fast. By the time authorities intervene, the harm is already done. This is why you can't half-watch this story anymore. Because by 2026, the Whittakers are no longer just vulnerable to poverty. They are vulnerable to impersonation, manipulation, and opportunistic control. And if you've ever felt compelled to help, if you've ever donated, if you've ever shared their story believing it would do good, then this part matters to you. Because compassion without verification is not kindness. It's leverage. And someone, somewhere, is always willing to use it. Before we move into who can legally stop a fake caregiver, and how quickly that happens, I want you to pause and reflect on one thing. If a stranger showed up tomorrow asking for money in their name, would you know how to verify them? Would you know who to call? Would you know what questions to ask? Would you know what red flags to look for? Most people wouldn't. And that's not a failure. It's exactly why this story keeps repeating. Before we go further, leave a comment answering this honestly. If someone claimed today they were the Whittakers' new caregiver, what would be the very first thing you would need to see before believing them? Not what you feel. Not what sounds right. What proof? The word caregiver sounds safe. That's what makes it dangerous. It's one of those titles people rarely question because in real life, caregivers don't always come with paperwork. Sometimes it's a neighbor. Sometimes it's a church member. Sometimes it's a friend who just helps out. And most of the time, nobody thinks to ask for proof because the role itself feels inherently good. But in 2026, in the Whittaker situation, that word carries weight far beyond its everyday meaning. Because when Adult Protective Services is already involved, when law enforcement has already investigated financial exploitation tied to this family, when confidentiality rules are actively shaping what the public is allowed to know, the idea of a new caregiver is not casual. It's consequential. So let's answer the uncomfortable question directly. Can someone just walk up and claim to be the Whittakers' caregiver? Legally, no. At least not without scrutiny. Practically, someone could still try. And that gap between trying and being stopped is where harm lives. Here's why. A legitimate caregiver in a situation like this does not exist in isolation. There is oversight. There are records. There is coordination with agencies. There is accountability. Real care, especially when vulnerable adults are involved, creates a paper trail whether people like it or not. But exploitation doesn't need a paper trail to begin. It only needs three things: access to the home, access to the people, access to an audience. And those three things have already been proven possible in this story. The manipulation doesn't start with "I have legal guardianship." It starts with "I'm helping them." It starts with grocery bags on camera, with small repairs filmed for proof, with phrases like, "They asked me to handle this for them." And then comes the pivot. They don't understand money. They don't know how to manage donations. They need help fast. That's not speculation. That's pattern recognition. Because when you study cases of elder exploitation and financial abuse, especially involving disabled or isolated adults, the script is almost always the same. The helper positions themselves as a translator between the vulnerable person and the outside world. They become the voice, the filter, the gatekeeper. And once that happens, everything changes. Money no longer goes to the family. It goes through the helper. Questions no longer get answered by the people living the reality. They get answered by the person speaking for them. Concern becomes framed as harassment. Verification becomes framed as cruelty. And anyone who pushes back is told they're hurting the family. This is how manipulation survives. Now, add the Whittaker-specific reality. Adult Protective Services has already intervened. That means the state has documented risk. It means professionals have already determined that at least some members of the household could not safely remain without intervention. That doesn't mean Betty and Larry have no autonomy, but it does mean the situation is being watched. And when a situation is being watched, new players don't slip in unnoticed for long. But not for long doesn't mean not at all. A stranger doesn't need months. They need days, sometimes hours. In that window, they can solicit donations, poison trust between family and supporters, create financial dependency, spread misinformation that becomes hard to unwind. By the time authorities step in, the damage is already real. And here's the part people struggle with emotionally. Not every harmful helper looks harmful. Some genuinely believe they're doing the right thing. Some convince themselves they deserve compensation. Some blur the line between help and control without ever saying the quiet part out loud. Intent doesn't erase impact. And the law doesn't care how good someone's story sounds if money is moving inappropriately or vulnerable people are being exploited. This is why the idea of anyone can just show up feels terrifying. Because in theory, they can attempt it. And in practice, the Whittakers have already been surrounded by people who claimed to help and later became the subject of investigations. This isn't paranoia. It's precedent. And that precedent is exactly why 2026 feels different. Because now, the system is alert. APS doesn't disengage quietly. Law enforcement doesn't forget an open fraud investigation. Local communities don't ignore strangers indefinitely. So if someone appears tomorrow claiming to be the new caregiver, here's what will happen behind the scenes. First, scrutiny. Who are you? Who sent you? What authority do you have? Second, monitoring. Are you collecting money? Are you controlling access? Are you isolating the residents? Third, consequences if answers don't align. And this is the part viewers need to understand clearly. A real caregiver does not fear verification. They don't rush you. They don't guilt you. They don't frame questions as attacks. They welcome transparency because transparency protects them as much as it protects the people they serve. A fake caregiver survives by urgency. Don't ask questions right now. They need it today. You're being negative. You're delaying help. That language is not accidental. It's strategic. And if you've watched the Whittaker story long enough, you've already seen how effective that strategy can be. So when people ask, who stops them? The answer isn't just one entity. It's layers. The state, the law, the local community. And this part matters you. Because exploitation only works when an audience cooperates. It works when people send money without asking where it goes. It works when skepticism is shamed. It works when emotion replaces evidence. And this story has reached the point where cooperation with confusion is no longer neutral. It's harmful. Before we move forward into exactly who intervenes and how quickly that happens in real life, take a moment to ground yourself in this truth. Helping does not require secrecy. Caring does not require urgency. And real protection never starts with trust me. If someone appears tomorrow claiming to be the Whittakers caregiver and asks for money, pause. Breathe. Ask one simple question out loud, even if only to yourself. Who is overseeing you? If that question makes them defensive instead of transparent, you already have your answer. Leave a comment and tell me this. What do you think is the biggest red flag people miss when someone claims they're just helping? The most dangerous part of this situation isn't the stranger who shows up claiming to help. It's the moment everyone else freezes because they don't know who has authority anymore. That hesitation is where exploitation breathes. So let's talk plainly about who actually stops it when someone inserts themselves into the Whittaker story in 2026, and what that process really looks like away from comment sections and speculation. First, Adult Protective Services. APS is not a casual observer in this case. Once they intervene, they don't simply step back and hope for the best. Their involvement signals something specific: documented risk. That risk can come from unsafe living conditions, cognitive impairment, financial vulnerability, neglect, or exploitation. Often it's a combination. When APS has already removed individuals from a household, as happened here, the case doesn't close. It transitions into monitoring, evaluation, and reassessment. That means the remaining household members aren't invisible. They are part of an active file. So what happens if a new person suddenly appears and claims to be helping? APS doesn't ask, "Are they nice?" They ask, "Are they authorized?" They look for patterns. Is this person controlling access? Are they speaking on behalf of the residents? Are they handling money, mail, or benefits? If the answer to any of those is yes, scrutiny increases fast. And here's the part most people don't realize. APS doesn't need proof of theft to act. They need proof of risk. If a stranger inserts themselves into the life of elderly or vulnerable adults who are already under observation, that alone can trigger an investigation. Because the law recognizes something the internet often forgets. Exploitation doesn't begin with a crime. It begins with opportunity. Second, law enforcement. The Whittaker situation is no longer theoretical for police. There's already been a public fraud investigation tied to fundraising and exploitation connected to this family. That changes how future complaints are handled. If a neighbor, a social worker, or even a concerned citizen reports that someone is soliciting money or goods for the Whittakers, police don't start from scratch. They reference prior history. They ask harder questions sooner. And this is critical. Law enforcement doesn't need to wait until money is gone. Financial exploitation statutes allow intervention when there is reasonable belief that a vulnerable adult is being manipulated or coerced into decisions that benefit someone else, especially when money, access devices, or donations are involved. So when someone claims to be the new caregiver and starts asking for funds, they aren't operating in a vacuum. They're stepping into an environment where authorities are already alert. Third, the community. This isn't talked about enough, but it matters more than people realize. The Whittakers don't live in a place where anonymity protects outsiders. This isn't a rotating apartment complex with strangers coming and going. This is a rural area where unfamiliar faces stand out, and neighbors know when something feels off. Locals have already seen what attention did to this family. They've seen cars pull up, cameras pointed, people linger where they shouldn't. That creates a different kind of vigilance, one that doesn't rely on hashtags or outrage. In practical terms, that means someone showing up repeatedly, asserting authority, or refusing to leave can quickly be viewed not as a helper, but as a problem. Trespassing laws apply. Harassment laws apply. And when vulnerable adults are involved, tolerance drops. So no, someone can't just move in quietly and take over without friction. But here's the hard truth. Even with APS, police, and community awareness, damage can still happen before intervention catches up. Because the real danger isn't always the person who stays. It's the person who comes, collects, and leaves. A few film visits, a few emotional updates, a donation link, and then they're gone, with money, with trust broken, with confusion left behind. That's why the audience matters, because the audience is often the accelerant. When people rush to donate without asking questions, they shorten the window between attempt and profit. When people attack anyone who raises concerns, they protect the wrong person. And when people confuse skepticism with cruelty, they unknowingly side with exploitation. This is where the Whittaker story has repeatedly gone wrong. Viewers wanted to help so badly that they forgot to slow down. They rewarded proximity instead of accountability. They trusted confidence instead of structure. They defended personalities instead of protecting people. And that's why 2026 demands a different approach. If a stranger claims to be the caregiver, here's what should happen, step by step, in the real world. First, verification is demanded. Who authorized you? What agency are you coordinating with? What role do you legally have? Second, financial transparency is required. Are you collecting money? Where is it held? Who controls it? Third, boundaries are enforced. No filming without consent. No monetizing updates. No isolating the residents. If any of those steps are resisted, the situation escalates. And here's something important to understand emotionally. Legitimate caregivers don't bristle at oversight. They expect it. They know scrutiny protects everyone involved. They know documentation shields them from accusations. They know that in cases like this, transparency isn't optional, it's survival. Only someone with something to hide treats accountability as an attack. Now let's talk about the most uncomfortable part of all. Why some people want to believe a new caregiver story without proof. Because it feels like resolution. It feels like relief. It feels like someone has finally stepped in. And emotionally, that's understandable. This story has been heavy, unresolved, and exhausting. People want a hero. They want an ending where help arrives and everything stabilizes. But exploitation thrives on that exact desire. The promise of relief, the illusion of control, the comfort of believing someone else has it handled. Real help is boring by comparison. It's slow, it's regulated, it's frustratingly quiet. And that quiet is often mistaken for neglect, when in reality, it's protection. Which brings us to the most important truth of this entire discussion. The Whittakers do not need a savior. They need boundaries. They need systems that protect them even when the internet is bored. They need oversight that doesn't disappear when views drop. They need supporters who understand that not knowing everything doesn't mean nothing is being done. So if someone shows up claiming to be their caregiver, the question isn't, are they helping? The real question is, are they accountable? If the answer to that is unclear, the safest response is distance, not donations. And that's where we leave this part of the conversation. Because in the next section, we're going to talk about you, the viewer, and the exact choices that either shut these schemes down or keep them alive. Before you scroll, before you share, before you donate again, think about this and answer honestly in the comments. What do you think is harder for people? The idea that someone might be exploiting the Whittakers, or the idea that there may be no dramatic update at all? Now we have to talk about the one piece nobody likes to examine, because it puts responsibility back on the audience, not on the strangers, not on the so-called caregivers, not even on the system, on the people watching. Because the truth is this: exploitation doesn't survive without participation. And participation doesn't always look like intent. Sometimes it looks like hope. Sometimes it looks like empathy. Sometimes it looks like wanting to believe that this time it's different. That's where things quietly go wrong. When a new face appears and says, "I'm helping now," the story instantly becomes easier. It gives the brain closure. It replaces uncertainty with a character. And once a character exists, people start filling in the blanks for them. They assume motives. They project goodness. They defend before verifying. And in the Whittaker story, that pattern has repeated itself over and over again. Someone shows up. They say the right things. They appear close to the family. and the audience decides that proximity equals legitimacy. But proximity has never been proof of protection. In fact, in vulnerable situations, proximity is often the first warning sign. Because real care doesn't require an audience. Real care doesn't demand belief. Real care doesn't collapse when questions are asked. Let's talk about how viewers unintentionally create the conditions scammers need. First, urgency addiction. When someone says they need money now, the clock starts ticking emotionally. People feel pressure to act before thinking. And urgency bypasses logic faster than any lie ever could. It creates the illusion that asking questions equals delay, and delay equals harm. But here's the reality that's uncomfortable to accept. If a situation is so fragile that it depends on immediate, unverified donations from strangers, then something is already wrong. That's not sustainable care. That's crisis exploitation. Second, moral intimidation. This shows up as language like, if you cared, you wouldn't question this. Why are you attacking someone who's helping? People like you are the reason they suffer. That rhetoric is powerful because it flips accountability into cruelty. It reframes skepticism as heartlessness. And once that happens, people stop asking the questions that would actually protect the vulnerable. Real help welcomes questions. Fake help shames them. Third, personality over process. People don't fall for scams because they're stupid. They fall for them because they like someone. They resonate with their tone. They recognize their face. They feel familiarity. But care is not a personality trait. It's a structure. Who oversees the funds? Who tracks the spending? Who audits the claims? If the answer is, trust me, that's not care. That's risk. And here's where it gets even harder to confront. Some viewers prefer informal helpers because formal systems feel cold, bureaucratic, slow, impersonal. People want warmth. They want to believe a kind stranger can do what agencies can't. But warmth without guardrails doesn't protect vulnerable people. It exposes them. This is where the Whittaker story forces a hard lesson. The moments when the internet felt most emotionally satisfied were often the moments that created the most long-term damage. Because emotion moved faster than protection. Now, let's talk about silence. In 2026, there's less footage, fewer updates, fewer voices speaking on behalf of the family. And that absence makes people uneasy. They interpret quiet as neglect. They assume something bad must be happening because nothing is being shown. But silence is not always abandonment. Sometimes silence is the boundary finally holding. When the state steps in, when confidentiality applies, when exploitation has already occurred, the safest thing that can happen is that the story slows down. That access is restricted. That information is limited. The internet hates that because the internet confuses visibility with care. But visibility has never guaranteed safety. In this case, it arguably did the opposite. So when someone tries to break that silence with a dramatic announcement, with new footage, with urgent claims, it feels like relief. It feels like life returning to the story. But ask yourself this. If silence was protecting them, who benefits when it's broken? Now I need to talk about the Whittakers themselves, specifically Betty and Larry. They're not influencers. They're not strategists. They're not equipped to navigate digital power dynamics. They are elderly individuals living inside a situation shaped by forces far larger than them. And every time a stranger claims authority, every time money is mentioned, every time a narrative is pushed, they are the ones absorbing the stress. Stress that affects health. Stress that affects trust. Stress that affects decision-making. And here's something that deserves to be said plainly, without accusation or drama. Even well-meaning attention can destabilize people who already live on the edge of capacity. Too many conversations, Too many opinions. Too many expectations. That's why isolation often follows viral exposure. Not because people want to hide, but because engagement becomes overwhelming. So when people ask, why won't they talk? Or why won't they confirm this? The answer may simply be, they're exhausted. Exhausted by scrutiny. Exhausted by pressure. Exhausted by the fear of saying the wrong thing and making it worse. And that exhaustion is exactly what exploitative personalities rely on. Because when someone is tired, confused, and isolated, they're easier to influence. They're more likely to accept help without questioning the cost. That's why the burden cannot sit only on the Whittakers to protect themselves. It has to sit with the audience too. Which brings us to the hardest question in this entire conversation. If no one new steps in publicly, if no donations are requested, if no updates come out, are people willing to accept that as the safest outcome? Or do they need a story to keep moving, even if that movement puts people at risk? Because here's the truth that doesn't fit neatly into a comment section. The best case scenario for the Whittakers in 2026 may be boring. No live streams, no fundraisers, no strangers claiming control. Just slow, monitored, imperfect stability. That doesn't satisfy curiosity. It doesn't feel like justice. It doesn't create heroes, but it prevents further harm. And that's the trade-off most people struggle with. They want transparency and drama. They want safety and access. They want protection and constant reassurance. But you don't always get all of those at once. So if you truly care about this family, here's the challenge. Can you tolerate not knowing everything? Can you resist amplifying unverified claims, even when they're emotional? Can you accept that sometimes the most ethical response is to step back? Because that's how exploitation actually ends. Not with outrage, not with new saviors, but with fewer opportunities to take advantage in the first place. Before we move into the final part, take a moment and reflect on this, then answer honestly in the comments. Do you think silence feels uncomfortable because it's dangerous, or because it takes the audience out of the story? This is where everything narrows down to one uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous moment in a story like this isn't when attention arrives. It's when attention gets bored, because boredom creates opportunity. When the headlines fade, when creators move on, when viewers stop checking for updates, the vacuum doesn't disappear. It deepens. And into that space step the people who are patient enough to wait, quiet enough to avoid notice, and bold enough to try again. That's why 2026 isn't safer by default. It's quieter, and quiet can mean protection, but it can also mean vulnerability if nobody is paying attention in the right way. Here's what matters right now. There is no verified public caregiver appointed by the state acting as a spokesperson. There is no verified public fundraiser authorized through a transparent, audited structure. There is no verified invitation for strangers to insert themselves into the Whittakers' lives. That's not neglect. That's containment. And containment is what stops repeat exploitation. The moment someone appears online claiming, "I'm helping them now," that containment is being tested. Not by the family, but by the audience. Because the first people who will be asked to believe it aren't officials. They're viewers. And belief is power. Every share gives legitimacy. Every donation gives leverage. Every defense in the comments gives cover. So here's the line that cannot be blurred anymore. Helping does not mean access. Caring does not mean control. And compassion does not mean suspension of judgment. If someone truly wants to help the Whittakers in 2026, their work will look unremarkable. It will be slow. It will involve oversight. It will involve limits. It will involve professionals, not personalities. And most importantly, it will not require strangers on the internet to act immediately or emotionally. Anything else is a warning sign. Now let's talk about responsibility, because it doesn't end with don't donate. Responsibility looks like this: refusing to amplify claims without proof, asking where oversight exists, not just who is involved, understanding that privacy can be a form of safety, recognizing that vulnerable adults are not public resources. It also means acknowledging something else that's hard to sit with. You may never get a satisfying update. You may never know exactly where everyone is, what every day looks like, or how every decision is being made. And that's not because someone is hiding something from you. It's because those lives are no longer supposed to revolve around an audience. And that's the point. The internet helped create this problem by confusing awareness with entitlement, by treating suffering like a story arc instead of a condition that requires boundaries. Now the internet has one chance to not repeat the same mistake. That chance looks like restraint. Restraint in what you share. Restraint in what you believe. Restraint in how quickly you decide who the hero and villain are. Because exploitation doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers the exact words people want to hear. I'm the only one helping. They asked me. Everyone else failed them. They need this now. Those phrases don't signal urgency. They signal isolation. And isolation is where harm thrives. So if a stranger ever claims to be the Whittakers caregiver and asks for money, attention, or trust, here is the standard that protects everyone. Proof before belief. Structure before sympathy. Verification before visibility. Anything less puts the family at risk again. This story doesn't need a new chapter written by someone chasing relevance. It needs fewer hands touching it, fewer voices speaking over it, and fewer assumptions filling in the gaps. Because sometimes the safest thing you can do for people you care about is not insert yourself into their lives, but protect the boundaries around them. Now, the final question, and it matters more than any theory. If someone showed up tomorrow claiming to be the Whittakers' new caregiver, would you demand proof, or would you feel pressure to believe them? Comment below with your honest answer and explain why. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.